This video is brought to you by Squarespace. From websites and online stores to marketing tools and analytics, Squarespace is the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence and run your business.
Hi, Julian. As far as I know, this painting was purchased by my grandparents at a sale in the 1950s or 60s. I first saw it maybe in the late 1980s. It was stored in an outbuilding on my grandparents' farm, and there it sat for maybe 30 years. After my grandmother passed away, I asked my aunt if I could take it. It's been hanging in my house in its present state for about 12 years. Pretty typical, I think, of Victorian advertising art. It's very brave. She has a lot of anticipation on her face. She's got her red hat on, she's got her fancy earrings on. So for me, the painting represents joy and anticipation and maybe even hope or something. Big patch across her face is just kind of a veil that needs to be lifted, I think. I look forward to meeting her when it's all done.
So there's our charge. Stabilize the structure, repair the damage, fill in the losses, clean off the grime and old varnish, and restore this painting to what the artist intended. So join along on this process as we begin lifting the veil. My client mentioned that this was likely Victorian advertising art, but man, is it beautiful. Imagine if all promotion and advertising looked like this. Well, with Squarespace, it can. With thousands of beautifully designed templates that work everywhere and anywhere, Squarespace will have you looking good. And with their new fluid design technology, you can drag and drop elements around your website to change things up or customize it as you see fit without the need of any code. But that doesn't mean it's just a pretty website. Under the hood is massive technology. From search engine optimization, e-commerce solutions, mailing lists, online scheduling, social media integration, shipping solutions, and more. Pretty much everything you need to run a successful business. So head over to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/Baumgartner to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. As with so many projects, the work before the work is of paramount importance. And for this project, we're starting off in the refrigerator where we store all of our adhesives and our lunches and have to make sure we don't confuse the two. I'm using a fish gelatin and Japanese mulberry paper to face this painting, and that's going to protect it and stabilize it. So much of this paint has already been lost, we want to make sure that no more is. To that end, I'm adding a little bit more fish gelatin to the mixture to make it more sticky, give it a higher adhesion rating. Sometimes we may want a low tack, and sometimes we want a high tack. For this painting, I want a high tack. I'm using small sections of the mulberry paper as opposed to one large one for a couple of reasons. One, it allows me to work in smaller controlled areas on this painting, which is incredibly delicate. It allows me to force in that paper into the nooks and crannies where the paint has started to lift off. And two, I have a huge stack of small squares, so I may as well use them up while they're here. This is a small painting, so applying all of this facing is relatively easy and quick, but waiting for it to dry over the next day is slower. Once it does dry and everything is stabilized, I can begin removing the canvas from the stretcher support, and these tacks have really rusted. This painting lived in a barn for many, many years, as we learned, and the high moisture content and poor environment resulted in these tacks breaking down. Once I've got all the tacks out, I'll lift off the stretcher and set it aside. This will need to be cleaned, but that's not a job for right now. I need to focus on the painting. At some point, wasps made nests on the back of this painting, and I need to remove all of the remnants. Somebody already pulled off the nests and probably threw them away or saved them, who knows. But I need all of this gone because it interferes with all of the treatments that I'm going to do. So with my scalpel just gliding across the surface, I can make quick work of the majority of the remnants of the nests. But there's still a lot of residue on the surface, and so I'm going to take a little bit of water and a toothbrush and just begin scrubbing it clean. There's no fancy way to do this, and I just want to break up all of the particulate, the mud, the dirt, and then come back with a cotton ball and lift it off. Yes, some of this is getting embedded in the canvas, but if I make a couple of passes, I can do a pretty good job of removing most of it. There might be some staining left, but ultimately this is the back of the painting, and while we do want it to be clean and look nice, this is not the focus of the painting. So if there are stains, that's okay, and most clients agree with me on that. While the canvas is damp or wet, I need to transfer it over to my hot table, because if I just leave it, it's going to start crinkling and distorting, and that could put pressure or tension on the paint layer and cause it to flake even further. I've heated up the hot table, and now I'm creating an airtight envelope on top of this painting. I have little vacuum bag connectors that can go through the mylar, and this is going to allow me to extract all of the air, which I do with my vacuum pump. And now I've got nice, even, consistent pressure across the entire painting. The table is warm, and I can start working the surface. This paint layer was really textured and lifting up, and you can see here with a little raking light, before and after I work it, it gets much smoother. And this isn't the only treatment I'm going to do to stabilize this paint, but this is the first treatment, and this is necessary before the next hot table treatment, which will not only stabilize it and rebond it to the canvas, but make sure it doesn't lift off again. Once the painting is brought up to temperature, I'll turn the heat off and then allow it to start the cooling process, which takes a few hours. We want it to cool nice and slowly and not have any rapid changes. And then I can remove the painting from this little envelope that I made and transfer it over to the table behind me. I'm going to use the cotton blotter paper that the painting was on underneath the painting, and then I'm going to take a piece of felt and lay it down on top of the painting, not only to protect the paint layer, but also to distribute the pressure more evenly, as the felt will conform to the impasto. After a few days under weights and allowing the painting to lose any residual moisture, I can take it out and transfer it to another table for the next step. Because all of that paint was lifting off, we need to find a way to bond it back down to the canvas. And we could do that by injecting adhesive under each piece of flaking paint and then pressing it. But that will only take care of the pieces of paint that are accessible, those that have started to lift off. The ones that will lift off in the future aren't going to be stabilized. So I'm going to do what's called an adhesive impregnation. I've thinned out a conservation adhesive, and now I'm rolling it on the back, making sure I have even distribution. Once it's dry, I will take it back to the hot table and place it on a piece of siliconized PET film. This is just a non-stick layer so that I don't glue the painting to the table. I've done that before, and luckily, because this adhesive is heat activated, I can turn the heat back up and activate it and take it off, but it's incredibly embarrassing and time wasting. Once the adhesive impregnation is done, it is now time to remove the facing. A little bit of hot water brushed onto these little squares softens up the adhesive. It reactivates that fish gelatin, and then it can be peeled up. One of the really great things about using this facing technique is that it pulls off some of the surface grime. Not all of it, but some, making this kind of a 2-for-1. It stabilizes the paint layer and protects it, and also takes up some of the grime so that when I have to turn my attention to cleaning the painting, well, there's just less grime to remove. So good job, Washi Kozo. And you can see as I remove this facing, none of the paint is coming with. The adhesive impregnation is stronger than the fish gelatin, and so when I lift this off, I don't lose any paint. And that's pretty cool, because otherwise, even if doing it locally, we'd run the risk of paint loss. So now we are turning our attention to cleaning. And the first thing that I need to do is remove all of the surface grime. That's the dust, the dirt, the debris that accumulated on the painting surface while it lived in that barn. And I'm using a neutral organic soap to break it up, and then a couple of cotton balls to lift it off. Midway through the cleaning process, I switched to remove the old varnish, and then I came back and removed more surface grime from the painting. And now, with it completely cleaned, I can turn my attention to the structural damage. There are some tears and holes that need to be repaired, and for that, I'm going to be using what's called the bridging technique. Unfortunately, this painting was not a candidate for reweaving of the tears. Because there's missing canvas, you can see there's a gaping hole, and the canvas was pretty brittle. So I'm dipping these little strands of Belgian linen in adhesive and then laying them across the tear. And you'll notice that I'm leaving a gap on purpose. I want some place for the fill-in material to ooze through and key itself in, or lock in place. I'll press it, and then once that's done over a couple of days, I can remove all of the weights in the felt, and we can see everything's been stabilized. Before I can return this painting to its stretcher, I need to add some material to the tacking edge. Again, because this painting is really brittle and the tacking edge is lost in some places, I have to add some more material so that A, the tacks have something to go into without pulling through, and B, something for me to hold onto while I'm doing the stretching. So I'll use a heat-activated film adhesive, the same one that I use for the adhesive impregnation, and I'll lay down my Belgian linen strips and iron them on. Once they're all ironed on, while the painting is flat, I'll now take the opportunity to add some ground to this raw canvas. If I don't do this, there's a good chance that the fill-in medium will stick, but there's also a chance that it won't, and it'll flake off in the future, and I don't want that to happen. So wherever there's raw canvas, I'm painting in this ground, and this will provide a nice base for the fill-in medium before I do the retouching. Once the ground is dry, then I can add my fill-in. This is a chalk-based fill-in, and using a palette knife, I'll just overfill the entire area. I'm not worried about the excess. I want to make sure that I've gotten all the losses filled in. Once it's dry, or once it's almost dry, I'll come back with a piece of felt and start removing the excess. And this is something that I saw master plasterers do in repairing a skim-coated wall. The felt is rough enough that it pulls up the plaster, but it doesn't abrade the painting or the wall. And so I can use this technique in my studio. Anytime there's a good technique, I will borrow or steal it, as long as it works for me and the painting. I still need to come back with cotton swabs and remove some of the excess, but that's relatively easy now. And now, with the painting ready to be married to the support and the support cleaned, I can align it and start the stretching process. This isn't terribly complicated. I've done it so many times it is almost automatic at this point. I'll lay out my tacks. These are 3-ounce blued steel tacks, which makes them sterile if I need to put them in my mouth for a technique called spitting tacks. But because this is a small painting, I don't need to do that. That's generally reserved for very, very large paintings where I don't have access to a flat surface where I can store all of my tacks. I'll fold in the corners to make sure that they're tight, and then I'll drive a couple more tacks in, and then the stretching will almost be complete. To finish off the back, I'll first remove the nails that I put in to hold the stretcher square and in place. If I don't do this, the stretcher can move and then I have a distorted support. I'll come back with smaller tacks and start folding and creasing over the excess canvas just to make it look nice and tidy. Because this painting didn't have any keys, those little triangular wedges of wood that expand the support when tapped in, I made some. And now I'll bind them in place with a little bit of fishing line, just to make sure they don't get lost in the future. Because there is so much retouching on this painting, I'm going to be putting down an isolation or saturation coat of synthetic resin, and this is going to allow me the best possible chance of matching the colors and have a nice smooth surface to work on. Well, that was a pretty good first pass, but I'll probably spend a couple more hours coming back in, just making sure I like the way it looks. That's how retouching works. You have to take a look at it in different lights at different times of day, just to make sure that it's the most even that it possibly can. And now it's time for the final varnish. And this is going to unify the sheen and provide an ultraviolet stable protective layer on top of the painting so that nothing discolors with exposure to UV light. Because this painting is relatively small, I'm going to brush it on. And I like to use a natural bristle brush because it holds a lot of varnish and the bristles are really thick. So if and when they fall out, they're easy to pick up. Some really fine hair brushes, those bristles are really hard to get out. And then I'll brush this varnish out, going over it back and forth as it dries to give it a micro texture, which makes the varnish look exquisite. But upon final varnish, I've noticed that there are a couple of spots that I missed. And sometimes that happens. I was so focused on the face that I didn't see these losses right here, so I have to come back on top of the final varnish and do a little bit of retouching. And I'll mix in some glossy resin into this paint so that it matches the sheen. Before I can send the painting back home to my client, I need to put my label on the back. We put these on when we intake the paintings, but sometimes they get lost or dirty, and so we have to put new ones on. And this contains information about what I use for retouching and varnishing, so that if it ever needs to be removed, there's no guesswork. So, here she is. Structurally stabilized and repaired, cleaned, filled in, retouched, and varnished. And wow, does she look beautiful. Lately, it seems as if I've been working on many damaged faces, and these are some of the most challenging and yet rewarding projects that come into the studio. Repairing a tear in the sky and retouching a cloud is maybe not as difficult, but certainly not as rewarding. But faces, we all know when they look right or wrong, and that is a really high bar to achieve. The rest of the painting also needed tons of work, and believe it or not, the retouching on the damaged background was more difficult and took more time and passes than the face. This subtle color transition is just really hard to get right without overpainting the whole area, which we don't do. But now, with all of those areas of damage and distraction gone, we can take a step back and appreciate what the artist had created for us, advertising or not. And like my client said, this once optimistic painting is now full of hope and joy, thanks to the veil being lifted. But don't take my word for it. Take his.
Hey, Julian, she's stunning. She's absolutely beautiful. I'm blown away. It's so beautiful, so perfect. I know my grandmother would be over the moon with happiness. I'm over the moon with happiness. Thank you very much for this amazing piece of work.